Welcome. My name is Philip Lovejoy, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harvard Alumni Association. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this session today. A few notes before we begin. Please note that today's program is an off-the-record opportunity created for our reunioning Harvard alumni and Crimson Society members. We are using Zoom webinar, so your camera and audio will remain muted. Closed captioning is available by selecting the CC button at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question for today's speakers, please send it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Questions are welcomed for either Director Tedeschi or Alexis Boo, our student tour guide. It would be great for you to include your class here with your question. I'd like to start with a warm shout out to today's co-host. This program was developed in collaboration with the Harvard Crimson Society. The Crimson Society represents those classes who have already celebrated their 50th reunion. It is led by a phenomenal group of volunteers who are committed to fostering alumni connections in the years between the traditional quinquennial milestone reunions. In addition to Crimson Society members, we have hundreds of Harvard College alumni with us today who are celebrating their 5th to their 75th reunions. So happy reunion from all of us at the Harvard Alumni Association. While I miss being together on campus, I'm delighted we have alumni from across the world joining in. I'm here in New Hampshire. I think Martha won't mind if I say she's in Wisconsin. And there are alumni here from across continents and time zones. Thank you for being here. It's now my pleasure to introduce Martha Tedeschi, the Elizabeth and John Moores Cabot Director of the Harvard Art Museums. Martha began her directorship in July of 2016. Prior to arriving at Harvard, Martha was the Deputy Director for Art and Research at the Art Institute of Chicago. A specialist in British and American art, Martha began her career there as a National Endowment for the Arts intern in 1982 and became a full curator in 1999. Now, as our director, Martha is committed to strengthening the Harvard Art Museum's excellence, innovation, and inclusivity. I encourage you to learn more about Martha's background and many accomplishments at the link in the chat. The Harvard Alumni Association is delighted to have Martha as a partner, and I look forward to seeing her and the Art Museum in person soon. Without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome Martha Tedeschi to the virtual stage. It's all yours, Martha.
Thank you so much, Philip, and hello, everyone. I'm truly delighted to welcome so many members of the Crimson Society today, and I invite you to join me for a glimpse behind the scenes of Harvard's 3 extraordinary art museums. Now gathered in dialogue with each other under one elegant glass roof, these holdings form the 7th largest art museum collection in the United States. As is our practice, I'd like to begin with a formal land acknowledgement. The Harvard Art Museums acknowledge that the museum's buildings and Harvard University are situated on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Massachusetts people. We collectively recognize the long history of the land which our institutions occupy today, and we strive to honor this relationship. So, Angela, may I have the first slide? Great, thank you. So I hope, just getting my screen adjusted here, folks, thank you. I hope many of you recognize this view from your own student days or perhaps from your visits to campus over the years. This is the facade of the venerable Fogg Art Museum at 32 Quincy Street, directly across from Harvard Yard and next to the Faculty Club and the Carpenter Center. The scene is student late night in early September 2019, which drew over 1,500 students. Unfortunately, in 2020, we were not able to have such a gathering for obvious reasons. But our goal always at the Harvard Art Museums is to help students see the museum as a place for them, however they want to use it and appreciate it over the 4 years they spend at Harvard. They will certainly, in many cases, use the museum for curricular purposes, class visits or assignments. but we want them to feel invited and welcome to use the museum as part of their own well-being, as part of their personal experience and story at Harvard. Angela, would you mind advancing the slide? I'm having trouble. Thank you. Here I'm showing you other views of the building that may be less familiar to you. Here you see different viewpoints of the major renovation undertaken with Italian architect Renzo Piano. The building reopened to the public in November 2014 after a 6-year closure for construction. This was a major renovation that took the site down well below ground, building state-of-the-art storage facilities and rising to 5 floors with a state-of-the-art conservation suite on top. If you haven't experienced it in person, I certainly hope you will. But I hope that many of you have had the chance to take in this building, which is now filled with light and purpose-built as a crossroad for the university and the world. The Harvard Art Museums, next slide, please, Angela. The Harvard Art Museums are first and foremost a teaching museum. We are a learning ecosystem that includes the Harvard community, but also learners of all ages, both locally and globally. Our values are intimacy and generosity. We specialize in creating memorable, interdisciplinary opportunities for learning together based on the interrogation of works of art. Next slide. Close looking, which you see going on in this slide, is a hallmark of our approach, using collections to help students and visitors alike hone their powers of observation, boost their visual literacy, and learn to trust their intuition about what they see. The beautiful art study centers on the new 4th floor are bathed in natural light and have some of the best views of Cambridge. So I invite you to come see. And they create world-class conditions for studying works from a world-class collection. These study centers welcome many classes each day, but are also available by appointment for members of the public. And we have everything from visiting scholars from all over the world, retirees from the Cambridge area, artists. People use our collections in so many different ways to boost their own personal creativity and tell their own stories. Next slide, please. So a major moment in our devotion to intimacy and object-based learning came on March 12th, 2020. I probably don't need to tell you that was when we had to close the museums in response to the pandemic. Our staff has been working remotely ever since then, making every effort to keep the same kind of collaborative spirit alive in the way we work together, and finding new ways to think about student and visitor engagement. This was the moment when we pivoted to virtual close looking and remote teaching. And what I'm showing you in this slide is 2 different seminars, actually, one on Egyptian art and one in which I participated based on the drawings collection. You see me here with 2 of our drawings curators. And it's when we realized that it wasn't a complete disaster trying to teach about the intimate experience of a work of art. One thing you can do virtually is you can get very, very close to a work of art, but you can do it with not just 15 people, you can do it with 400 people or 1,000 people in many different countries at many different times of day and different age groups. So we discovered a lot in doing this quick pivot about the needs of our audience and the potential of virtual engagement. Next slide, please, Angela. The Strauss Center for Conservation and Technical Study is one of the jewels of Harvard, a suite of state-of-the-art laboratories now on the top floor of the museum, is where art and science meet on a daily basis for research and collection care. It is the first center for conservation science in the United States. And ever since the 1920s, we have been training a major training site for young conservators and scientists. And this continues apace. If you were to take take a poll of conservators in major museums across this country, but also abroad, you would find that every other conservator had a stint of training as a fellow or a pre-program intern at the Harvard Art Museum. So we continue to take that role of training very seriously, as well as our role as a place for research and the coming together of artistic and scientific inquiry. Like many members of the museum staff, our conservators also play an active role in teaching Harvard students. Next slide, please. A word about the three museums that form the current Harvard Art Museums. The FOG, which is the oldest of the Harvard Art Museums, is known for its encyclopedic collections. Its particular strengths involve historical American art, seen here, and also works on paper, prints, drawings, and photographs. Here, sorry, just getting caught up with my notes here. Next slide, please. And here you see examples from our galleries of modern and contemporary art. Contemporary art is an area of strong engagement for students. Harvard's undergraduate population, as you may know, is becoming more ethnically and racially diverse every year. This year, more than 20% of freshmen are first-generation college students. That's a really major milestone. Having a strong contemporary program that incorporates topical subject matter and debate is critical for promoting a relationship between the students and the museum. Next slide, please. The second museum is the Busch Reisinger Museum, which celebrates the art of German-speaking lands. Here are two of its greatest icons by Franz Marc and Max Beckmann. This museum, which has many supporters in Europe, is a key aspect of our international outreach. Next slide, please. The third of the three museums comprising the new Harvard Art Museums is the Asian Art Museum. Its collections are particularly strong in Japanese and Chinese art. This past year, we celebrated an extraordinary new promise gift of Japanese Edo period painting from the collection of Robert and Betsy Feinberg. Here you see the exhibition in the catalog that marked that gift. Harvard's astounding collections continue to grow each year through the generosity of alumni. And in this case, it has allowed the establishment of a leading graduate program in Japanese art at Harvard. Students are now coming from all over the world to do their PhDs in Japanese art because of the gift of the Feinberg collection. Next slide, please. Of course, curricular engagement with the collection is at the core of our mission. Interdisciplinarity is a key goal, reaching out across the curriculum to include the STEM fields, business, law, and medicine. We teach a course for radiology students, for example, with Brigham and Women's Hospital. This course teaches radiologists, young radiologists, to question their assumptions, to not take things at face value, to pay attention to what they're observing and question the assumptions they're drawing from those first observations. In this side, you also see the first course taught just this semester with the engineering school, which examines materials and their failure. Why do certain materials give out? Why do they fail? Works of art and the way they degrade and deteriorate are really wonderful examples, and the students base their research projects on works in our collection. Next slide, please. Engaging a broader community of learners is also mission critical, and we often design our programs to promote intergenerational exchange, as here in our popular Haiku and You programs associated with the Painting Edo exhibition, which I just mentioned a moment ago. Next slide, please. Being in the virtual realm over the last year gave us a chance to think about families and children. And so we've developed a suite of virtual programs for families and children aimed to add enrichment during a year where parents were struggling to educate their children from home. Here you see on the left coloring books in 3 different languages that add coloring opportunities to learning activities based on our Egyptian collections. And on the right, you see one still from a series of interviews we did with museum staff about the jobs they do, targeted to high school students. Next slide, please. We are totally energized at the prospect of a return to in-person engagement this fall. It will be wonderful to have students back on campus. They are a big part of the dynamic environment we always strive to foster at the Harvard Art Museums. We are in many ways the front porch of the university, and we take that responsibility seriously. This past year's closure has been challenging on many fronts. As one member of our staff said, the best part of working for a museum is working in a museum with the collections, with the public in a beautiful building. But we've learned a lot about ourselves as an institution and about the needs of our audiences. We've been sustained by our friends and supporters during this time and would love to welcome you to the Harvard Art Museum family. Next slide, please. So starting in September, please come see for yourself what's happening at 32 Quincy Street in Cambridge. And if you can't come in person, do join us online, where we have a thriving global community of all backgrounds, interests, and ages. We are maintaining our commitment to digital content and virtual programming. Wherever and whenever we see you, you can be sure of a warm welcome. Next slide, please. So thank you. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Alexis Boo, who will be your guide for her very special tour entitled Untouched. Alexis is a junior in Kirkland, studying history of art and architecture with a secondary in music. She's also media chair and senior guide for the student guide program at the Harvard Art Museums this year. To her, the intersection of theory and practice is the most intriguing part of art making, and she enjoys exploring the process of creation more than anything. She has created for you and Harvard Art Museum audiences a special tour entitled Untouched. And so without further ado, I welcome Alexis Boo to take us on a tour. Thank you, Alexis.
Thank you so much, Martha. I'll go ahead and share my screen and we can get started on this tour. So throughout this tour called Untouched, I'll be asking a lot of questions and you're invited to interact with me via the chat box. So if you wanted to open up your chat box and switch the little blue panel that says to panelists and switch it to panelists and attendees. So me and everyone else that's in the Zoom can see what you guys are all saying. I've also never done a tour to this big of an audience before, so hopefully this goes well. But hi, welcome to Untouched. This is a virtual tour of the Harvard Art Museums. And while unfortunately we can't physically be in the space today, if we were, this is what you might see. Upon immediately entering the Harvard Art Museums, you'll find yourself in our courtyard. You'll also notice I'm using the museums in the plural, like Martha was talking about, that we have 3 distinct collections housed within one building. And I'll be featuring one object from each of the collections today. Before we begin, again, I can just shortly introduce myself. So hi, my name is Alexis. I am a rising senior at the college, concentrating in the history of art and architecture, secondary and music. On campus, I would be living in Kirkland House. I'm very excited to return next year. And I'm originally from the Washington, D.C. area located in Potomac, Maryland, where I am sitting currently. So I'm really excited to take you on my tour today. We'll be exploring artworks that sort of arguably lack the physical touch of the artist's hand or otherwise have some kind of tension in their process of creation. Feel free to ask questions throughout the tour using the chat function, and I will do my best to answer, and otherwise we'll try and circle back to some of them at the end. So we'll go ahead and jump to our first object here. And before we dive in, I just wanted to ask everyone to take a minute to inspect this work of art and think about where we are. If you just wanted to type into the chat, making sure it's to all panelists and attendees, where do you think this place is located? Japan, right off the bat. Yeah, so you guys are very, very observant. This is an artwork called Cloudy Day at Muzaki in Ibaraki Prefecture. So yes, this is on the coast of Japan, which you also might have picked up on from the text at left. Sarah Marshall says a fishing village in Japan. I would actually also agree with that. It looks like there are some boats, maybe a fishing village for sure. So I also just wanted to ask, what medium do you think this is? Do you think maybe it's like colored pencil, watercolor? Let me know what you think, and also maybe why you might think that. You say woodblock print, woodcut, woodblock. Okay, very, very astute observations. Some people are also saying maybe watercolor. It does sort of look like it has this wash. So yeah, this is a Japanese woodblock print, which is a unique style of printing. And I wanted to show you just a short process video of it. So here we have the outline of a print. And all of these lines were actually carved onto a woodblock and then pressed onto the sheet of paper. So just to clarify that these weren't really drawn in ink. Here you'll see there's a printer and they are going to fill in the sky of the print. You'll notice that the block has sort of this unique shape carved onto it. So that's because wood blocks are separated by color. So this is like the shape of the sky. The printer has added mineral pigments to the block, is brushing them on, trying to get an even distribution across the carving, and then we'll be taking the piece of paper that had the outline that we saw earlier, right here, trying to line it up evenly, and then pressing it onto the block. And here again, using a stone tool, trying to get an even distribution. And the way that Japanese woodblock printing is done is that all of these blocks and colors on the final print are separated by color, right? So when all of these different blocks are sort of pressed onto the same sheet of paper, the resulting image is a fully colored print. And the artist can continue doing this with as many layers of color as they want. So you'll see here now the blue and some of like the shadows have been pressed onto this piece of paper here. Jeremy asked, does the artist first draw on paper? So this is something that we'll sort of return to as we talk about this object further. Artists will make a design and then so the first outline that we saw wasn't actually drawn on paper. It was all the outlines were carved into a separate block that was pressed onto that sheet of paper. But we'll see some of the sketches that the artist has done. I'll go ahead and skip through to the end of this green part, right? So that's going to be sort of the field that's in this block. And again, all of these are sort of building up to this final print. So when we look at this image by Kawase Hasui, we're witnessing the results of this same piece of paper being pressed onto a ton of different wood blocks and corresponding pigments. Ingrid asks, how do you shade? So that would be done by the person who's putting the pigments onto the carving block and maybe getting like a gradient effect. That's why they use a special brush tool to sort of, fade things out as they go. When we want to get a sense of the number of blocks carved to make a print, we want to consider the number of colors that you see. So does anyone have a guess for how many different pressings maybe occurred with this block, or how many different blocks were made for this print? Molly says 7. We got a range here. Nina says 35, 7, 15, 5, 6, 7. Of course, I can speak a little bit more slowly. John says 100. So we're getting into a really wide range. I'll actually admit I don't actually know the answer. I think it's a fun question, though, to sort of think about, because it asks you to consider all the labor that goes into a single print, thinking about how many different colors, how many different blocks were used. This would be just my guess in a work like this with so many distinct elements and colors, right? We have the rooftops of these buildings, the wooden planks of the house, there is the paper screen doors, this comforter located on the left inside of the building. We also have a stone path, or the stones on the perimeter of a dirt path, and then all of this greenery. The ocean itself has 4 colors alone. The sky is also something to consider. I would guess at least 15 blocks. I can't be totally sure. I couldn't find information on the exact number, but I would say maybe between 15 to 20 blocks could have been used for this single print. something inherent to all print media, whether it's screen printing or woodblock printing, is its ability to be reproduced. So if you get a new sheet of paper and you press it onto these same carving blocks with the same colors, you can make a new impression of it, right? So we actually have a handful of different impressions of this print in the Harvard Art Museums, as you can see here. And I just wanted to ask, what do you notice about these impressions? Any observations that you might have? Emily says lighter and darker, darker, difference. I think that's supposed to be saturations. Interesting how the color intensity varies. Yeah, absolutely. Everyone has great observations. I love this. So everyone is picking up though on my main point, which is that they're different, right? So this is kind of a result of printing being a very human process like we saw in the video. So that's part of why this happens. In maybe image 1 and 2, it looks like the same pigments were used maybe, but some variations, especially in the sky, probably the result of the human hand and like pressing onto the block differently. But then in image 3 and 4, it looks like these are just entirely different colors used altogether. So you can also manipulate how the final product will turn out. Maybe there were different pigments, maybe even different papers were used to print onto it. So it's really cool to see how one image can actually be, multiplied in a lot of different ways. I also wanted to show you this image, which is actually not a different impression of the print. This is a watercolor sketch of Kawase Hasui, the artist. And Japanese woodblock printing, the whole process is actually divided into 4 separate jobs. So we have Kawase Hasui, who we would actually call the designer. So he's the person who comes up with the image, decides the colors, the atmosphere, the goal of the painting, sort of running the show. And then we have the carver. So this is the individual who is actually physically making the different wood blocks that we saw in the video earlier. So the carver would be in charge of breaking up the different elements of the work of art and then carving them into separate blocks for these different color fields. And then we have the printer. So this is the person actually in the video that we saw earlier who was laying down the colors, trying to keep them as uniform as possible across different prints, actually physically pressing the paper onto the block, trying to keep it as even as possible so things are all lined up in the final image. And then we have the publisher. So this person is in charge of disseminating these images. We talked about how printing makes a ton of copies, technically, of the same image. So this is the person who's trying to sell them, actually commercialize these pictures. For Kawase Hasui, he largely worked with the same publisher whose name was Shozaburo Watanabe. So this person played a really pivotal role in skyrocketing Kawase Hasui's career by actually selling his prints to international audiences instead of Japanese audiences in the beginning. So after the US occupation in Japan, prints actually skyrocketed as a medium. In Japan, prints were not really considered a high form of art because they were sort of cheap and they were easy to be reproduced, like we saw, because you can sort of sell a lot of them, right? Because you can make a lot more with all of your blocks. So they actually made for the ideal souvenir for American soldiers who, buy them, bring them back to the US, and sort of contributed to their proliferation in the West and like an item to be collected, which is pretty interesting. Question about different criteria for best woodblock print. I'm actually not sure the answer to that. I would imagine something that is quite labor intensive and has like a lot of colors. Maybe you're wondering how this was made. I feel like that's a question I usually consider when I'm looking at wood blocks, is if I can't really figure out how it was put together, I feel like that's a good sign. Pamela asks, is the pigment like watercolor media? So it ends up, so this is actually a watercolor sketch that we're looking at currently, but in the final prints, it's usually mineral pigments. So sort of like powder and like dust with a kind of animal glue. And then that's what is spread across the carving block. And Emily asks, how many prints would be made and was there any kind of limit? So this is an interesting question about print just in general, of whether you limit the number of prints you make so they feel more like limited edition. I'm not sure how many prints would be made. I would imagine for something like this, because they were trying to sell a lot of them, they would make as many as they wanted to sell. That would be my best guess, but I'm not 100% sure. Moving on with the tour. So Kawase Hasui, the designer, he's also making images like this, again, talking about this watercolor versus pigment thing. So he's making a bunch of like pencil sketches, watercolor sketches. You can see he's figuring out the composition, coloration of the final work that he wants. But ultimately, when we look at the final print here, Hasui's physical hand is actually not a part of this image when you think about it, right? So I think this is a really interesting point to consider when we look at Japanese woodblock prints and as we continue to look at artworks throughout this tour. So here we are discussing the artistry of Kawase Hasui, but I can't tell you who carved this and I can't tell you who printed it. There are a handful of names of people he worked with, but they're very, very rarely mentioned or valued nearly as much as Kawase Hasui. Actually, in 1956, Hasui was recognized by the Japanese government as a living national treasure, but there's really no attention given to these other craftsmen who are like very integral to this process. So the question that I want to pose now and urge you to consider throughout the remainder of this tour is, is it really Kawase Hasui who made this work? Is he the one whom we owe it all to? There are lots of tensions between the artist and the process of creation, and I want to tease apart some of these complexities and shed light on the untouched nature of some artworks. We'll continue thinking about authorship and its ambivalent nature, as well as labor throughout the tour. And with this in mind, we can move on to our next object. Before that, I can try and answer Mary's question. How common is it for the content to change between the sketch and the print? Since the watercolor doesn't have the comforter, the people, did the carver change or did the original artist? I think a lot of it would be driven by the original artist, so the designer, but also the publisher would have a lot of sway in what was to be produced because they're the ones who have all the connections and are trying to sell something that, people want to buy as well. So this is our next object here. I just wanted to ask, do you recognize this person? Who do you think it is? John Lennon, John Lennon. We're getting a flood of John Lennons in the chat box. Yeah, absolutely. Keen observation. This is John Lennon. I'll admit that I actually myself, I didn't have any idea who this was when I first saw this photograph, sort of showing off my youth a little bit. But yeah, so as indicated by the title, this is a photograph of John Lennon by Richard Avedon from 1967. And you'll also notice this tag here that says printed by Gary Schneider. So what does this mean? As you might guess, similarly to Japanese woodblock printing processes that we discussed before, the film photographic process can actually be broken into multiple roles as well. Here we have that of the photographer and the printer. So in this case, we have the photographer, Richard Avedon, who set up the scene. He composed a shot, sets up the lighting, decides settings for the camera's exposure to the film, and takes a snap. We traditionally call Richard Avedon the artist because he captured this photograph, right? But right now we're actually looking at the product of Gary Schneider, actually looking at his handiwork, who is the printer. Cameras are loaded with film. That's where the information is stored when you take a photo on a film camera. And the printer is the person who translates this tiny film negative into a full physical image, like on an actual sheet of paper. So they're the ones who's working in the darkroom, preparing the negatives, working with chemicals, considering things like temperature, variances between different materials, thinking about what kind of paper maybe to print this on. So all of those sort of background things that maybe we don't think about, this is everything that the printer is considering. We can sort of think of the photographer as a composer for a symphony and the printer as the actual musicians who are doing the performance, right? So they're very inherently linked and they depend on each other to bring the work to completion, but these are ultimately two separate roles. So Richard Avedon actually did a whole shoot with all the Beatles, pictured here. And Gary Schneider, the printer, was known for being very collaborative with all the photographers that he worked with. He always wanted to fully embody their intention with a photograph, help them realize their vision on paper. And photographers usually were in the studio with Schneider while he did his printing. So something unique about Schneider's experience with Richard Avedon, this photographer, is they actually had very little contact with each other. Avedon would provide written instructions for what he wanted, and then, like the kinds of shadows or highlights or midtone expression that he wanted, would send this information to Gary Schneider. Gary Schneider would do it, send a draft back called a proof. That's like a photographic draft is called a proof. Send a proof back to Richard Avedon, and they would communicate in this back and forth way without actually having to be in the same physical space with one another. To further emphasize the role of the printer in actually physically producing the image that the public will end up seeing, we can look at these same photographs except printed a different way. So this is a collage of Avedon's portraits of the Beatles that were reprinted in a magazine. It is a mass-produced image, on magazine paper. And then here are all the portraits as printed by Gary Schneider. Pretty meticulously considered, they're printed on special photographic paper. So I just wanted to ask, how would you describe these? What is maybe different or the same about these two reproductions of technically the same image? If anyone wanted to drop any observations that they might have between these two prints. There are some deep shadows and contrasts. The second is moody, darker, background indifferent. Oh, I like this. The solo portraits are more honest. That's a really, really good way to describe it. Yeah, tonal qualities, separate images are a little bit more realistic. I would agree with that. There's too much contrast in the ones on the bottom. Yeah, so a lot of the details are sort of blown out. Yeah, absolutely. Great observations. If we were to just return to this photograph of just John, just focus here, basically everything has been saying, everything everyone is saying, it definitely applies, right? So his hair is super fluffy. You can see each of the individual highlights on each of his strands of hair, the way it curves around his face. These details are sort of blown out in the magazine version, right? A lot of them just sort of disappear. Also, to the left of his face, you see a lot of like the volume of his eye socket and his cheeks, and you can see the little like sunspots or freckles that he has. All of these details are sort of blown out again in the magazine version. The tonal quality someone was commenting on, it's much cooler in the magazine version compared to the Gary Schneider version. So really interesting to see how, right, this is the same photograph, same negative, just, visualized in different ways. So I also wanted to ask, we can just launch a poll right now to see which do you all like better. I promise there's no right answer. It's probably pretty clear that I prefer Schneider's work, but I'm curious what others might think. Ingrid says Schneider for the win. I would agree. So there is sort of like an overwhelming majority of people liking Schneider's. And some people do really like the magazine print though. And I've given this tour before and people have also liked the magazine print. And partially I think it's because it is much moodier, much more somber, and that might appeal to different audiences. So pretty interesting to see though, how same thing, just printed different ways technically. You might also argue that while Richard Avedon set the scene for the shot for sure, right? We do really rely on Gary Schneider for bringing it to life in a different way. So as we saw before, without Gary Schneider, Avedon maybe can't fully express what he set out to do with this photograph. In this vein, Gary Schneider is really a crucial component to this artwork, because what we're looking at currently is the product of, Schneider's physical labor. Even if he is trying to honor the artist's intention as fully as he can, follows the direction of the photographer, Gary Schneider still has to contribute a lot of his own independent practice and knowledge in making the final image here. We can even add another layer of thinking when considering who really made this photo. We could say Richard Avedon, we could say Gary Schneider, we could even say John Lennon himself did, because without him, we don't even have a photograph. If this were just like some random man in the street, I don't think anyone would be as compelled to be looking at this. So depending on how you think about it, we potentially have three different figures that could be considered like the ultimate creator in the end. We have the photographer, the printer, and then the subject itself. I also just wanted to ask if you wanted to drop this in the chat. Who do you think is the ultimate creator? In your eyes, who made this photo and why? Is it Richard Avedon? Is it Gary Schneider? Maybe John Lennon? It's sort of like a bit of a more complex problem to talk about in this vein, but I'm curious about everyone's thoughts, or if you at least have maybe a different perspective than before. We're getting an overwhelming Avedon response, which is pretty typical. Yeah, lots of Avedon. Schneider should get some more credit because it is, Sarah says, truly collaborative, which I agree with. I think it's hard to pin down one person in the end, but interesting to think about how there's a lot of different minds that are at play and what we consider, something done by a single person. We will continue on to our last object here. So here we have a stained glass window. And when you think about stained glass, I just wanted to ask, what kind of associations do you have? Do you maybe think of a certain space or place, or maybe certain kinds of images? Religious art, church, religion, church, houses of worship. Yeah, absolutely. So if you're thinking anything religious, church, cathedral, definitely a valid association. It's also what I think immediately. So it might surprise you that this was created in 1912 for just an exhibition for the artist friend, not a religious space at all. But when looking at this, what might make you think that this is a religious image? We have a woman with animals here. Jeremy says similarity to others. Yes. Catherine says robes and bare feet. Composition, crown on head, blue dress, robes. Yeah, so I'm getting a couple comments are mainly pointing to this robe, which I would agree with because the Virgin Mary is almost exclusively depicted in this blue mantle. So that's why a lot of people tend to think that this is maybe religious imagery. Also, we have two deer on either side of this woman here, and deer depicted drinking from a water fountain is actually considered baptism imagery. And while we don't have a fountain here, the way that the blue cloak is sort of pictured, you can envision that it might be representative of water. Ultimately, scholars have been confused by her pose. She's like, has a sort of like broken wrist, like raising the roof motion here, and that seems to confuse scholars, which is why they haven't pinned this down specifically as being the Virgin Mary. Maybe it really just is as simple as woman with animals. So the artist listed here is Max Pechstein, a German artist born in 1881. He actually grew up with formal art training and eventually became a leading artist in the group called Die Brücke. Sorry if my pronunciation is really not that great. This translates to the bridge in English. This was an organization of painters who saw themselves as a bridge between old and new art, or art for the future. This group was active between 1905 to 1913, so really not that long at all, but they did really pave the way for German Expressionism, which was to come. These groups are seeking to defy the conventions of traditional painting. Their work could collectively be described as utilizing very strong color planes, very bold outlines, as we can see expressed through this stained glass. And many of the artists in Die Brücke were inspired by primitivism, meaning that they sought inspiration in African art and art of the Pacific because of its, quote, lack of artifice. The main media that Die Brücke artists worked in was actually woodcut prints and oil painting. And Max Pechstein, this artist here, was actually known for his figural oil paintings. So that brings us to the intrigue of stained glass as a medium then. You'll notice the name Gottfried Heinersdorf at the bottom of your screen here, who helped Pechstein create this glass. So Gottfried Heinersdorf was a super prolific glass artist at the time in Berlin, sort of the guy when it came to stained glass in the 20th century. He opened up his own workshop in Berlin where this was produced, had his own apprentices. And even as we call this a work manufactured by Gottfried Heinersdorf, we actually can't be 100% sure that it was him who ended up constructing this work. In the back corner of this work, there is some sort of evidence of maybe someone else's name scratched into it. So not 100% sure, but we do consider it manufactured by him. I also keep using this term manufactured, which gives the impression that this was made via like an industrial process, but in reality, it's very far from that. So Heinersdorf practiced traditional stained glass techniques in his workshop, which you can tell by the many bubbles trapped within the glass. So here is an image of the scallop pattern that frames the woman. You'll see like this orange, blue, white pattern that's around her whole body. This seen from behind, you can see how textured it is, right? This tells us that the glass was hand blown. So these are all air bubbles trapped within it. The process of handcrafting stained glass includes heating a mixture of sand, sodium carbonate, and calcium carbonate to thousands of degrees, sort of blowing it into something that's a little bit more manageable than just like a mass, and then cutting this more manageable mass into sheets, and then cutting these sheets into like these precise cookie cutter shapes that will fit into the prepared frame. You can also see all of the hand soldering marks on the joints of this frame, again, giving more weight to the fact that this was handcrafted. So you can imagine all the physical labor that is involved in this process, right? The literal breath of the maker is embedded within this piece. And it's actually not Max Pechstein's, which is interesting to think about. Pechstein could not have done this work without Heinersdorf and his workshop. But at the same time, we can assert that Pechstein didn't create this work. He did design the image himself, and he actually painted on it, which is interesting. So here is a view of the stained glass on the left seen from behind, and then on the right seen, just normally. And you'll notice that all the face details are missing. So the reason you don't see them on the back is because they were all just painted on the front. There are some limitations to glass. It's a pretty hard material to work with. These sort of shapes are nearly impossible to like create and maneuver in such an intricate way. So Pechstein would go in at the end and bring this work to life with his painting. All of the shading and clothing folds are actually all painted in too. So glass is hard to work with. It's hard to make objects look volumetric. So in order to build form, Pechstein would apply some paint in the end. So Gottfried Heinersdorf was known for being incredibly collaborative with everyone that he worked with. It's hard to find a work of his where he didn't actually collaborate with someone else, whether it was another glass artist or a painter like Max Pechstein. And collaboration is interesting to think about because it sort of inherently produces something more innovative and new because of the different creative energies that are at play, right? They're just more technical skills that each contributor can provide, a wider range of media that can be utilized. We're looking at both glass and paint. It's sort of complex when we think about the limits of Pechstein's hand in this work. There are things he can't do, but also you can consider his involvement in his creation, right? His hand still is a part of this work. So sort of a complex problem to think about. But moving on. So throughout this whole tour, we've been thinking about the final physical product that we're looking at in the galleries or on our screens as being untouched by the person traditionally listed as the artist. The person that we think of as the creator or sole creator of something. As we've seen, these things aren't so black and white, and there are lots of tangles in defining who really made something. An alternative title for this tour, as opposed to untouched, could be something like collaboration. There are lots of minds at work in all of these artworks, and maybe it isn't fair to have to choose just one person, which I was sort of making you do with this John Lennon photograph, but it's really not fair to ask anyone to choose one person. I think it's really interesting to consider the creative process and all the hands that are involved in it. Part of what I hope to do with this tour when I was creating it is to draw attention to the hard work of those whose names are often left out of the art historical discussion, or even just sort of erased entirely. The idea of authorship is really not as clear as I think we're led to believe, not just with art from the 20th century, like we've gone over in this tour, but also just like in life and a lot of the products and things that we use on a daily basis. It's important to not just think about collaboration, but also like the actual bodies and labor that is involved in making anything. Really, sometimes that can even be forced labor. So how often we don't learn the names or stories of all these people who are involved in the creation of everything surrounding us. So the next time that you find yourself in a museum gallery and are reading the name of the listed artist, I encourage you to consider the names that might be excluded or just all the different people who really did contribute to making the final image. Even these labels, which are something that we think of as objective and authoritative, like plastered on a museum wall, they actually can have a kind of historical bias to them and can leave out many invisible but very important hands. So thank you so much for coming to my tour. If you wanted to keep up with the Harvard Art Museum student guides, you can follow us on Instagram, where we're most active at Harvard Art Happens. Find us on Facebook at Host Student Guides, and we actually are doing tours throughout the summer, mainly through the month of June, and they'll be premiering on Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern Time and Saturdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. We have our first summer tour tomorrow, or is it tomorrow? Yeah, tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time with Sophia Motz, and she'll be going over the topic of climate change in art.
Alexis, thank you so much. This is Heather with the HAA. I'm going to just share a couple quick things. The first actually sort of mirrors what we're seeing in the chat right here, but it was a pre-submitted question, or a pre-submitted comment, just saying, I don't have any questions, but just appreciation for you, Alexis. I have a deep respect for liberal arts students and know that you are needed in this world. In an AI future, humanity and kindness will matter more than ever. Thank you for your tour.
Well, thank you so much. That's so nice of you to say.
So we're going to turn to Martha in just a moment to ask a couple closing questions, but I'll ask a question of you, Alexis, that I'll also pose to Martha. So when folks are able to be back in the museum, what is your do not miss piece of art?
This is a question for me or for Martha?
Yes, absolutely, Alexis.
This is actually something interesting about the tour that I just gave is none of these works are actually on view, which is something I found pretty beneficial about being in the virtual tour format, which, you know, obviously you can be sad that we aren't actually in the galleries, but I can show you a lot more works of art that you maybe wouldn't see in person because we have just such an extensive collection and a lot of them happen to be in storage actually. A must-see work of art. Oh, geez. I would say our painting Edo collection is actually like one of my favorite spaces in the galleries currently. I'm not sure if it'll still be on view in the fall. Maybe Martha can answer that question. It's called Fish and Turtles. I can throw this in the chat. I'm gonna put it in capital letters. It's called Fish and Turtles. It's by the artist called Maruyama Okyo. And it's this like silk screen that has fish and turtles on it. And I just think it's like a beautiful and very delicate work of art that is really interesting in its construction based on like the way that the light filters through it is really unique. So yeah, you can also visit that on our website. And we have a Painting Edo collaboration with Google Arts and Culture as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So we'll turn back to Martha for our last few minutes. So Martha, I'll ask if you would like to speak to the Finding Edo exhibit? And then I'll also pose to you the same question of what is your do not miss piece in the collections?
Okay, great. First, I want to add my own congratulations to Alexis. That was such a treat. What a great tour. And you raised so many questions that have always fascinated me as an art historian and a scholar. So thank you. So the Painting Edo exhibition, unfortunately, is coming down in June before we will have the chance to reopen the museums. It was open only for a month before we had to go into lockdown, which is why any of you who've been tuning in have seen that we've gone into real overdrive to make that exhibition come alive virtually. So in addition to the collaboration with Google Arts and Culture, we've done a number of different immersive tours. We've had virtual walkthroughs with the designer of the installation. We've had a number of really great collaborations with the Arboretum, where we talked about the actual plants and trees that are shown in these beautiful paintings. So, and the haiku workshops have been, have taken their strength from that show. So the exhibition, which has 2 catalogs associated with it, has had its own life, but a kind of untraditional life, unfortunately. The good news is all the works in that exhibition are promised gifts to Harvard, and they will continue to be on view in the Japanese galleries in rotations going forward, and will eventually come to live at Harvard in perpetuity. So although the exhibition had a different trajectory than we expected, it's still going to be very much part of our lives at Harvard. In terms of must-see objects, as a former curator of works on paper, which are often not on view, but which you can see in museums that have study rooms, I want to recommend to everybody that you make an appointment at the Harvard Art Museums in the Study Center to look at the Harvard Art Museum's collections of Winslow Homer watercolors. This is an area that I've devoted my own scholarship to and did a major exhibition of. And there is nothing quite like sitting with a box of these watercolors by yourself in a beautiful light-filled room and just looking and getting in to the mindset of the artist. So I would say, give yourself that joy. In terms of things you'll definitely find on the wall in the galleries, I would send you looking for Kerry James Marshall's Portrait of an Artist, which is about race, but is also about color and the continuity of being an artist. So those would be my two recommendations for today.
Wonderful. So we only have a couple minutes remaining, so this will be our final question. So we had a couple people write in to ask explicitly about how do you determine what pieces come into the collections?
So that's a great question. And it's a good one since we were just talking about the big gift from the Feinbergs. Harvard alumni are incredibly generous, and we get offers of works of art from collections all the time. In addition, our curators are always watching the market, looking for works that might fill in gaps or in some way enhance the offerings of our collection. And ultimately, whether something's a gift or whether we're thinking of it as a purchase, they have to go through a rigorous process of research. We carefully research the provenance as well as the history and making of an object. That means we need to know where it came from, whether it, whoever is selling it has legal title to it, whether it might have been, loot during World War II, whether it might have been removed in some unethical way from an archaeological site. So there's a lot of due diligence, making sure that an object even is available for us to consider. After that, a report from a conservator is critical. We want to make sure that the work is in good condition, that it's authentic. Sometimes conservators can find that things have been retouched or that there are multiple hands at work or that something's a copy. So those are the things we don't want to be surprised about later. So the condition and conservation report is critical. And then our curators, who are all art historians, have to make a justification for the acquisition, in which they also are asked how it fits into the collection. We ask ourselves, why Harvard, why now? Is this an object that will be used for teaching? How does it speak to other objects in the collection? Does it fill a gap? Is it starting a new area of collecting? Is it helping us to diversify our collections? We have a whole series of questions we ask each other. So it's quite a rigorous process that takes a number of months. And, in many cases, we have to walk away for various reasons. Something's in bad condition. We can't take care of it properly. It's too big. We don't have the storage facilities. We don't think that it will be used for teaching. It may run the risk of being, languishing in storage. So, all of those are questions that we ask ourselves before something comes into the collection. It's a highly selective process.
Thank you very much, Martha. I am just really grateful that you've taken the time to be with us today, to share these wonderful museums with our alumni, and that all you do for the university in leading these wonderful institutions, and also for your leadership and the way that you've brought art to our alumni through this challenging 16-month period we've been living through. And we all cannot wait to walk back into those museums, that beautiful courtyard, and enjoy that wonderful art. I think also, what we saw today is just a wonderful example of how the museums are used as an art laboratory, a teaching laboratory for our students. And Alexis, your tour was just extraordinary. One of the great secrets about me is I was an art history major in college, which is something that's like long gone in my past, but you brought it all right out. And I was participating along in the chat, and it was just a great format and really engaging. And it was just terrific to hear your views and the way you brought us all together. So Alexis, thank you so much. Martha, thank you so much. And to all of our alumni who joined us today, I hope you're enjoying your reunions, and I look forward to seeing you at other reunions. And have a great remainder of the day.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you all.